They were supposed to be the safe ones, the daughters, the girls their parents fed, paid for, worried over, and loved without question. But the 10 young women in this video did something almost impossible to imagine. They turned on the very families who raised them and helped end the lives of the people who loved them most. Then they did something just as cold. They lied. They sat across from police officers, sometimes with tears running down their faces, and told stories about intruders, kidnappers, and strangers who never existed. A few played the grieving victim. Some pretended to be missing. One even hid her own mother inside a suitcase and slipped away. For a short time, a handful of them were actually believed. But every lie eventually fell apart, brought down by a parent who survived, a piece of evidence left behind, or a guilty conscience that would not stay quiet. These are 10 daughters who did the unthinkable, then looked the law in the eye and lied. Section 1. Jennifer Pan. To almost everyone who knew her, Jennifer Pan was the kind of daughter most parents only wish for. She lived with her mother and father in Markham, a calm, tidy town just outside Toronto, Canada. Her parents, Han and Bic Ha Pan, had come to Canada from Vietnam with very little money and even less of a safety net. They found work in a car parts factory, put in long shifts, and saved every dollar they could. The point of all that work was simple. They wanted their children, and especially Jennifer, to have the bright, secure life they themselves never had. So they pushed her, and they pushed her hard. From the time she was little, Jennifer's days were filled with piano lessons and figure skating practice. She would sit at the piano for hours. Her parents expected top marks at school and treated anything less as a real failure. For a long stretch of her childhood, she kept up with it all. She won piano awards. She carried home report cards full of high grades. Her mum and dad proudly told relatives that their girl was going to grow up to be a pharmacist, maybe even a doctor. There was only one issue with this perfect picture. Almost none of it was true. Somewhere in her school years, Jennifer began to fall behind the impossible standards set for her. Her grades were not the flawless run of top marks her parents believed she was earning. Instead of admitting this, she made a decision that would quietly twist the next decade of her life. She started faking it. When a report card came back with marks she knew her parents would never accept, she changed them by hand and by computer until the low grades looked like high ones. Her parents trusted her completely and never thought to call the school, so the trick kept working. From there, the lie kept growing year after year. Jennifer told her parents she had finished high school near the top of her class. She had not actually earned her diploma.
She told them a university in Toronto had accepted her into a program to become a pharmacist. That was invented too. For years, she played the role of a busy college student. She would get up, pack a bag, leave the house, and return later as though she had spent the whole day in lectures. She handed her parents fake school documents. She even let them believe she was doing real training inside a hospital. In truth, there was no school, no program, and no training. She was building an entire fake adult life and performing it daily for the 2 people who loved her most. Tangled up in all of this was a young man named Daniel Wong. He had been Jennifer's boyfriend since their high school days, and the two stayed connected for years. Her parents did not like him at all. They believed he was involved in selling illegal substances and saw him as someone with no real future.
To a strict mother and father who had given up so much for their daughter's success, Daniel looked like a danger to the whole plan they had mapped out for her. They did everything they could to keep the couple apart. For a long time, Jennifer and Daniel simply kept their relationship hidden, but a secret that large is almost impossible to hold forever, and Jennifer was already carrying so many of them. One by one, the cracks started to show. The truth came apart in pieces. Her father grew suspicious of the university story and started paying closer attention. When he looked into it, he discovered the unthinkable. Jennifer had not been attending school at all. The straight-A student, the future pharmacist, the responsible daughter. None of that person was real. She had spent close to 10 years building her identity out of nothing but lies. Her parents were shocked and deeply angry. They responded by tightening their grip on her completely. They took control of her phone. They limited where she could go and who she could see. They told her plainly that her relationship with Daniel was over. By this point, Jennifer was a grown woman in her 20s, yet she was being treated like a child who could no longer be trusted, locked into strict rules inside her own home and cut off from the person she wanted to be with. The pressure that had been building since childhood now had nowhere to go. Out of that pressure came a plan so cold that, once it became public, it stunned the entire country. Jennifer decided the surest way to win back her freedom, keep her boyfriend, and get hold of her parents' savings was to remove her mother and father from her life for good. She and Daniel reached out to people who would carry out such a thing for money. In the end, a group of men agreed to the job. The arrangement was as simple as it was chilling. They would enter the family home and end the lives of both parents.
Jennifer stood to inherit the family's money, an amount reported to be around $500,000, and she would finally be free to live the life she had been pretending to have all along. It happened on the night of November 8, 2010. 3 men came into the Pan family home while the household was settling in for the night. Jennifer was there. The men took her mother and father down into the basement. A weapon was used. Bitch Ha Pan, Jennifer's mother, did not survive. Han Pan, her father, was struck and badly hurt, with a serious wound to his head. By any normal expectation, he should not have lived through it. Somehow he did, and that single fact would later unravel everything. While the attack was taking place, Jennifer was upstairs, loosely tied to a railing. After the men left, she managed to call for help. When emergency crews and police arrived, what they saw was a frightened young woman who appeared to be the only survivor of a robbery that had spun out of control. This is the exact moment that makes Jennifer Pan belong on this list. She lied, and she did it calmly, in detail, and without hesitation. She told police that armed strangers had forced their way into the house to rob the family. She said the intruders had tied her up, dragged her parents downstairs, and that she had been completely helpless to stop any of it. She presented herself as a terrified daughter who had barely made it out alive. She cried. She gave full statements. She sat through one interview after another and held firm to the same tale every time. As far as she wanted everyone to believe, she was nothing more than the lucky one who lived. For a short while, the act held together. From the outside, the scene really did look like a home invasion. The young woman was alive, clearly shaken, and giving a steady account of what she said had happened. But a few small details refused to fit, and experienced investigators caught them. The first problem was basic common sense. Why would robbers go to the trouble of tying up the one witness who could describe them, then harm the parents downstairs, and then leave that witness alive and able to phone the police? It simply did not add up. Real break-ins almost never play out that neatly. Then there was the strange matter of the phone call itself. Jennifer claimed her hands had been bound, yet she had still found a way to call for help. The way she described being tied did not line up with the chaos of a true, violent robbery. The story sounded rehearsed rather than lived. The most damaging blow to her lie came from the one person who was never supposed to speak again, her father. Against incredible odds, Han Pan pulled through. He spent time unconscious in the hospital, and as he slowly recovered, his memory of that night began to return. One memory cut through everything. He recalled seeing his daughter moving around freely during the attack, and even speaking with one of the intruders in a calm, friendly way, as though she knew the man personally. A real victim, fearing for her life, does not casually chat with the people harming her family. That memory pointed in only one direction. Investigators then started pulling phone records and messages connected to Jennifer and Daniel. What they found tied the couple straight to the men who had entered the home. The shaken survivor on the staircase was in fact the person who had arranged the whole thing. Police brought Jennifer in for questioning more than once. Each time, she repeated her version of events, sticking to the role of the innocent daughter. But the evidence kept stacking up, and the questions grew sharper and harder to dodge. During a long third interview, the lead detective made it clear that they already knew the truth. That was the moment Jennifer finally cracked. Her story shifted. She admitted she had taken part in hiring the men. Her explanations kept changing, and at one point she even tried to claim she had arranged for the men to harm her, not her parents. Whatever she said next, the wall of lies she had built her whole life around had finally fallen. She was arrested. The case went to trial and gripped the country. Jennifer Pan, her boyfriend Daniel Wong, and the men involved in the attack were all charged. In December 2014, a jury found Jennifer guilty on the most serious charges possible for the loss of her mother and for the harm done to her father. She was handed a life sentence with no chance to even apply for release for 25 years. In a detail almost too painful to imagine, her father, the very man she had marked for removal, sat in that courtroom and spoke against her. The little girl he had pushed so hard toward a perfect future had tried to erase him from the world. The story did not completely close there. Years later, Canada's higher courts reviewed how the jury had been guided during the trial and decided the original result on the top charge could not stand. New proceedings were ordered. In early 2026, instead of facing a fresh trial from the start, Jennifer pleaded guilty to a reduced charge connected to her mother's passing, while her responsibility for the attack on her father stayed in place. The legal paperwork may have shifted over the years, but the heart of the case has never changed. Jennifer Pan helped plan a deadly attack on her own mother and father, then sat in front of police and pretended to be a helpless victim of it. What makes her case sit so heavily with people is not only what she did, but how naturally the lying came to her. The fake report cards, the invented university, the years of leaving the house and pretending to be a student, all of it had been practice. By the time she was facing detectives across a table, lying was second nature. She had been doing it for most of her life. The home invasion story was simply the largest and final lie in a very long chain. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Jennifer Pan needed a whole team to pull off her plan. Hired men, a boyfriend in on the secret, months of careful scheming. The next young woman on this list needed none of that. She was just 16 years old, she acted nearly alone, and the story she fed police was even simpler than Jennifer's. The catch was that it would not take a surviving parent to expose her. It would take science. Section 2. Sarah. Johnson Bellevue, Idaho, is the kind of small town where nothing much is supposed to happen. It sits in a quiet mountain valley, the sort of place where neighbours know each other by name and front doors often go unlocked. People there had not seen a serious crime like this in more than 10 years. That peaceful little town is where Sarah Marie Johnson grew up, and in the late summer of 2003, she was just 16 years old. From the outside, Sarah looked like any other teenager. She was pretty, blonde, and well known around town as the daughter of Alan and Diane Johnson, a respected and hard-working couple. She had an older brother who was away at college. By every appearance, the Johnsons were a normal, stable family, living a normal, stable life. But underneath that calm surface, a fight had been building between Sarah and her parents, and it was about a boy. The boy was Bruno Santos. He was 19 years old, a few years older than Sarah, and her parents could not stand the relationship. They saw him as trouble and as someone who could pull their teenage daughter down a dangerous path. Because of the age gap between the two, Alan and Diane warned Sarah that they could get Bruno into serious legal trouble if she did not end things with him. To a 16-year-old who believed she was in love, that threat did not feel like protection. It felt like her parents were trying to destroy the most important thing in her world. That anger did not fade. It hardened. And on the morning of September 2nd, 2003, Sarah Johnson did something that would shock the entire valley and the country beyond it. The plan she carried out that morning showed a frightening amount of thought for someone so young. Before sunrise, Sarah got ready in a way meant to keep any trace of the crime off her own body. She pulled a shower cap over her hair. She put on a pink bathrobe, wearing it backward over her pajamas so the front of her would be covered. She slipped a glove onto each hand, one leather and one made of thin latex, the kind doctors use. She was trying to make sure nothing would stick to her skin or her clothes. The weapon she chose did not even belong to her family. A tenant rented a small guest house on the property
and he had left town for Boise, expecting to be gone for about a week. Inside that guest house was a powerful bolt-action hunting firearm. Sarah took it. With the firearm in hand, she walked into her parents' bedroom, where her mother was still asleep. She used the firearm on her at close range. The sound woke her father, who had been in the shower. As he came out to see what had happened, Sarah used the firearm on him too. In a matter of moments, both of her parents were gone, and a 16-year-old girl was standing alone in a house that had just become the worst crime scene the town had seen in a generation. What she did next was meant to send police chasing someone who did not exist. Sarah placed knives at the foot of her parents' bed, and even in her brother's empty room, trying to make the scene look like the work of dangerous outsiders. She took the sight piece off the top of the hunting firearm and set it on the bed in the tenant's guest house, while leaving the rest of the firearm behind at the scene. Then she set about getting rid of the things that could tie her to what had happened. The shower cap went into the toilet, flushed away. The pink bathrobe and the gloves went into the garbage can outside the home. Her hope, almost certainly, was that the garbage truck would roll by, empty the can, and carry the evidence off forever. Only then did Sarah run. She raced to a neighbour's house, pounding on the door in a panic. When the neighbour opened up, Sarah was hysterical, crying that someone had hurt her parents. This is the moment that earns Sarah Johnson a place on this list, because the story she told was a complete invention. She said that she had been asleep in her own bedroom when she was woken by loud noises. She said she ran to her parents' room, found them already harmed, and that she had no idea who could have done it. A stranger, she claimed, an intruder. Someone had broken into the home, attacked her mother and father, and slipped away into the early morning. In her telling, Sarah was just a frightened girl who had survived a nightmare she had nothing to do with. The neighbour called for help, and when officers arrived, Sarah gave them the same story. She held on to it. At first, in a town unused to anything like this, the idea of a random intruder was almost easier to believe than the truth. But it did not take long for that story to start falling apart, and the reasons were both small and impossible to ignore. The first issue was the house itself. There were no signs that anyone had forced their way in. No broken locks, no smashed windows, nothing to show that a stranger had entered. A break-in usually leaves a mark, and this one had not left any. Then there was the way Sarah told her story. Each time investigators sat down with her, the details seemed to shift. She would add things that did not fit the questions she was asked, and the version of events kept moving around. To the people questioning her, it sounded less like the confused memory of a traumatized girl, and more like someone trying to keep an invented tale straight. Even members of her own family began to have doubts. Her mother's sister noticed that the story changed every time Sarah spoke to police, and slowly stopped believing her own niece. The single most important decision in the entire case was made by the local sheriff, and it was almost absurdly simple. On the morning of the crime, before the garbage truck could make its normal rounds and empty the can outside the Johnson home, the sheriff had it stopped and turned away. That one choice saved everything Sarah had tried to throw out. When investigators looked inside that trash can, they found the pink bathrobe and the gloves she thought she had gotten rid of. The science buried in those items spoke louder than anything Sarah could say. The bathrobe carried a fine spray of traces that could only have landed on it if the person wearing it had been standing right beside both of her parents at the moment they were harmed. Even more telling, the only human traces on that robe belonged to 3 people: her mother, her father, and Sarah herself. No mysterious stranger. The gloves told the same story. On the outside, they carried the residue that gets left behind whenever a powerful firearm is used. On the inside, where a hand would go, was Sarah's own DNA. There was more, and each piece tightened the net. The t-shirt Sarah had been wearing under the robe had dried green paint on the front. Tiny flecks of that same paint were found on the inside back of the bathrobe, proving she had worn that robe over that shirt, exactly as investigators believed. Her socks carried traces that placed her right next to her parents, even though she had insisted she never went near them. The evidence was not whispering, it was practically shouting. Police had originally wondered about Bruno Santos, the boyfriend at the centre of all the family tension.
He seemed like an obvious suspect. But when his information was checked against everything found at the scene, nothing connected him to it. There was no trace of him on the robe, the gloves, or anywhere else that mattered. Santos was so eager to clear his own name that he later agreed to speak against Sarah in court, wanting everyone to know he had played no part in what happened. The intruder Sarah had described, the dangerous stranger who supposedly slipped in and out, had never been there at all.
The evidence pointed at one person, and she had been standing in the house the whole time. Sarah was charged with the most serious offence possible, 2 counts of first-degree wrongdoing, 1 for each parent. Because of how much attention the case drew in her home county, her trial was moved to Boise in Ada County so a fair jury could be found. The trial laid out the science piece by piece. On March 16, 2005, the jury reached its decision. Sarah Johnson was found guilty. The punishment matched the weight of what she had done. She was sentenced to 2 life terms with no chance of release, plus an extra 15 years tied to the use of the firearm. She was sent to the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center, where she has spent her entire adult life behind bars. She was still a teenager when those doors closed, and she has now spent far more of her life inside prison than she ever spent free. Here is the part that sets Sarah Johnson apart from many others.
She has never admitted to any of it. Through the years, through appeal after appeal, she has stuck to the same claim she made to that neighbour on the morning it happened, that a stranger did this and that she is innocent. Her legal team and outside groups have tried more than once to win her a new trial. They argued she had poor legal help the first time. They argued that newer testing methods, including a look at fingerprints on the weapon, might point somewhere else. The courts, including the highest court in Idaho, listened and rejected those arguments. As of now, the conviction stands, and Sarah remains where the jury sent her. When you step back and look at the whole thing, what stands out about Sarah Johnson is how plain her lie really was. Jennifer Pan needed a hired crew and a boyfriend and months of planning to build her false story. Sarah needed almost nothing and no one.
She was 16, she acted on her own, and her entire defence came down to a single sentence. A stranger did it. It was a story with no proof behind it and no person to attach it to. In the end, it was not a surviving family member who undid her, the way it was for Jennifer Pan. It was a bathrobe in a trash can, a few flecks of paint, and a sheriff who thought to stop a garbage truck. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The 2 young women in this video so far were both pushed toward a breaking point by parents who disapproved of the person they loved. The next case follows that same painful pattern, but it goes much further and costs far more lives. This time the daughter would not pull the trigger herself, and she would not act alone. She would convince other people to do the unthinkable to her entire family, and when it was over, she too would try to wear the mask of a victim.
Section 3. Erin Caffey. In the piney woods of East Texas, near the small towns of Alba and Emory, the Caffey family looked like the picture of everything good. Alba was tiny, a community of fewer than 500 people, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and away from a passing car is just normal manners. The Caffeys were deeply religious, the kind of family that built its whole week around church. They belonged to the Miracle Faith Baptist Church, and faith was not just something they did on Sundays, it shaped their entire lives. Terry Caffey was a youth pastor there, the father figure to a whole flock of local kids. A Bible verse was even carved into a wooden sign that hung above the family's driveway, so that anyone who came to visit was greeted by their faith before they ever reached the door. Music ran through the whole family. Every one of them played something. Penny, the mother, played the piano at church. The 2 boys, 13-year-old Matthew and 8-year-old Tyler, played guitar and harmonica, and 16-year-old Erin Caffey sang during services. People who were there remember that she sang with so much feeling that she would sometimes be moved to tears. Her father Terry, her mother Penny, and her 2 younger brothers all worshipped together, side by side, week after week. The children had even been homeschooled for a few years under a Bible-based program. To their neighbours, the Caffeys were warm, gentle, and devoted to one another. Nobody watching that family sing on a Sunday morning could have guessed what was coming. Like the two young women before her on this list, Erin's path toward disaster started with a boyfriend her parents did not want her to have. His name was Charlie Wilkinson, and he was 18. The two of them met in 2007 when Erin was working a part-time job at a local Sonic drive-in restaurant, serving customers on roller skates. Charlie was a rough-around-the-edges, outdoorsy type, and the two of them fell hard and fast. Their young romance grew intense quickly. At one point, Charlie even gave Erin his late grandmother's engagement ring as a promise of the future he imagined with her. Around the same time, Erin asked to leave homeschooling and return to public school, enrolling at the local high school just weeks before everything fell apart. Erin's parents began to notice their daughter changing, and not for the better. The shy, church-singing girl they knew started slipping away. She lost interest in things she used to love. She pulled back from her youth group. She stopped wanting to sing at church the way she once had. Worried, Terry and Penny did what a lot of concerned parents do. They looked into the boy who seemed to be pulling their daughter into a different world. One day, Erin left a computer on, and Penny saw Charlie's social media page, which was full of crude language and references to alcohol and grown-up content. This was not the clean-living young man they wanted for their daughter, and what they saw confirmed every fear they had. The breaking point came in February of 2008. Erin broke a rule her parents had set about phone use, and that small act of rule-breaking was the last straw. Terry and Penny told her plainly that her relationship with Charlie was over, for good. They believed they were protecting their teenage daughter. Instead, they set off something terrible. Erin did not accept the decision and move on. She began telling her friends that she wanted her parents removed from her life. Not grounded, not argued with, but gone. She seemed to believe that the only way she and Charlie could ever be together was if her family was no longer in the way. At first, the people she said this to did not take her seriously. Teenagers say dramatic things when they are angry, and most of the time those words mean nothing. But Erin meant them. In fact, she had reportedly raised the idea before, with an earlier boyfriend, asking him to harm her family. That young man had refused and ended the relationship with her. With Charlie, though, she found someone willing to listen. Charlie himself would later tell investigators that he had actually suggested they simply run away together, but that Erin shut that idea down. Running was not enough for her. She wanted her parents gone. The plan that came together was not something Erin carried out with her own hands. She gathered other people to do it. Charlie Wilkinson agreed. He brought in a friend named Charles Wade, who was 20, and Wade brought along his 18-year-old girlfriend, Bobby Johnson. Wilkinson promised Wade a few $1,000s for his help, a price tag on an entire family. The roles were set. The young men would go inside. Erin and Bobby would wait in the car. The whole thing was planned out over the better part of a month. Late on the night of February 28th and into the early hours of March 1st, the group drove out to the Caffey home. Erin slipped outside in her pyjamas to meet them, and then she and Bobby Johnson stayed in the vehicle as the getaway drivers. Before the two young men went in, there was a chilling exchange that the attackers would later describe to investigators. Wilkinson supposedly warned Erin that to leave no one behind who could talk, he would have to harm her little brothers too. According to what they told police afterward, Erin told him to do whatever he had to do. She knew her young brothers were in that house. She gave the go-ahead anyway. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, a noise woke Terry and Penny, the sound of the bedroom door being shoved open. Terry's first sleepy thought was that one of the kids had had a nightmare. Then Charlie Wilkinson came into the parents' bedroom carrying a small firearm and used it on the couple. Terry Caffey was hit 5 times. He lay there, badly hurt and unable to move, beside his wife. When the firearm stopped working properly, Wade used a long blade on Penny. The two then went upstairs to find the boys. Lying wounded and helpless, Terry could hear what was happening to his sons, a horror no parent should ever have to endure. Matthew and Tyler did not survive that night. By the time it was over, 3 members of the Caffey family were gone, and only Terry was left clinging to life. The attackers were not finished covering their tracks. After taking valuables from the home, they poured lighter fluid and set the house on fire. The plan was for the flames to swallow the evidence and the family along with it. They drove off, leaving the Caffey home burning in the dark, certain that no one inside could possibly have lived. By one account, as they sped away from that burning house, Erin was not crying or shaking. She made an excited, almost celebratory remark, as if she had just pulled off something thrilling, rather than destroying her own family. They were wrong about one person. As the fire spread, Terry Caffey came back to consciousness. Somehow, with 5 wounds in his body, he found the strength to pull himself out of a window and away from the burning house. Then began one of the most incredible survival efforts you will ever hear about. Terry crawled. He dragged himself across the ground, in the dark, badly injured, for several hundred yards, until he reached the home of his nearest neighbour, a man named Tommy Gaston. Gaston called for emergency help, and Terry was rushed to a hospital in nearby Tyler and into surgery. A trauma team fought to save him, and against every expectation, he survived. When he was stable enough to speak, Terry told investigators something that cracked the case wide open.
He had recognized one of the attackers. He knew Charlie Wilkinson's voice, and he was certain Wilkinson had been in his home that night. With that, police had a direct lead, and in a small town where nearly everyone knows everyone, they moved fast. Now we come to the reason Erin Caffey belongs in this video. When officers tracked down Charlie Wilkinson, they also found Erin at the trailer where he was staying. She did not present herself as the person who had set the whole thing in motion. She appeared to be in shock, shaken and frightened, and she told the police a very specific story. She claimed she had been kidnapped. In her version, she was a victim too, swept up against her will, just another person harmed by whatever had happened at her family's home. It was the same instinct we have already seen twice. Do something monstrous, then put on the face of the innocent. The trouble for Erin was that her story did not survive contact with the facts, and it fell apart quickly. The 3 people she had pulled into the plan, Wilkinson, Wade and Bobby Johnson, all told investigators a version of events that pointed straight back at her. Their accounts lined up in the worst way for Erin. They said that Wilkinson had actually suggested the group simply run away together, but that Erin was the one who insisted her family had to be removed. She was not a hostage. She was the reason any of it happened. Physical evidence sank her claim even further. When Erin was tested, there were no signs that she had been drugged or forced into anything against her will. What the tests did show was that she had breathed in smoke. A girl who had been kidnapped and taken far from the burning house would not have smoke in her lungs. Erin had been close enough to that fire to inhale it. Piece by piece, the kidnapping tale dissolved until nothing was left of it. There is a haunting detail from those hours too.
While her 3 accomplices sat in police stations telling the truth and naming Erin as the planner, Erin herself was being driven to the hospital by her own grandparents to see her wounded father, still wearing the mask of the grieving, innocent daughter, even as the truth closed in around her. The frightened victim in the trailer was, in reality, the planner who had waited in the car while her family was attacked. All 4 of the people involved were charged with the most serious crime Texas has, capital wrongdoing, 3 counts of it, 1 for each life taken. The 2 young men who went inside, Wilkinson and Wade, could have faced the most severe penalty the state allows, and prosecutors initially aimed to seek exactly that. They were spared it for a reason almost impossible to believe, and it came from the man who had lost the most. Terry Caffey asked that they not be put to death.
He wrote to the district attorney and explained that ending their lives would not bring back his wife and sons, and that he wanted the people responsible to have the chance, someday, to feel true regret. Because of his mercy, Wilkinson and Wade each received life behind bars with no possibility of release. Bobby Johnson, who had driven and waited, was sentenced to 40 years, with a chance to ask for parole after serving 20. Erin Caffey, the daughter at the centre of it all, pleaded guilty. She was handed 2 life sentences plus an additional 25 years. Under that sentence, she will not even be allowed to ask for release until she has served around 40 years, which means she will be an older woman, close to 60, before she gets her first chance at freedom. She had wanted to escape her parents' rules so she could live the life she chose. Instead, she traded her entire youth and most of her adult life for a cell. The most heartbreaking thread running through this entire case is the father who lived. Terry Caffey lost his wife and both of his sons in a single night, was nearly taken himself, and then had to face the unbearable truth that his surviving child had played a part in it. For a long time afterward, he sank into a deep, dark despair, the kind that makes a person wonder why they survived at all. The turning point, by his own account, came when he finally returned to the spot where his home had stood, now just ashes, and cried out for some kind of answer. When he looked up, he noticed a piece of paper caught on a nearby tree, carrying a simple message that reminded him that God was still in control. For Terry, that small moment was when he was finally able to begin forgiving. And forgive he did, guided entirely by his faith. He says that forgiving Erin actually came easier to him than forgiving the two young men who carried out the attack. In time, he rebuilt his life from nothing. He remarried, built a new blended family with both a child of his own and adopted sons, and turned his unimaginable pain into a full-time ministry, travelling to hundreds of schools and churches to share his story and offer hope to people carrying their own grief. He even wrote a book about what happened and how his faith survived it. And in perhaps the most stunning act of all, Terry regularly makes the drive to visit Erin in prison, year after year, showing up for the daughter who helped orchestrate the destruction of his family. He has spoken about her with love rather than hatred, and to this day he reportedly struggles to fully accept that Erin was the mastermind behind what happened. A father's heart, it seems, can refuse to believe the very worst about his own child, even when the evidence is overwhelming. That refusal does not change the verdict. It only makes the whole story sadder. As for Erin, she has never stopped trying to shape how people see her. In an interview years later, she chalked the whole thing up to her own poor choices and has suggested she was manipulated into it, even though the people who acted alongside her placed the blame squarely at her feet. What separates Erin from the others we have looked at is that she never picked up a weapon herself. She did not need to. Her tools were her words and her ability to talk other people into doing something they could never undo. She pointed and others acted. And when the smoke cleared and her father somehow survived to tell what he heard, her very first move was to claim she was a victim of the crime she had ordered. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The first three young women in this video all stayed close to home, in quiet towns and ordinary houses, and all of them eventually faced the police on their own soil.
The next case takes us thousands of miles away to a luxury resort on a tropical island, where another daughter and another boyfriend her mother could not stand turned a dream vacation into something out of a nightmare. And the way she tried to hide what she had done was so strange and so bold that it is still talked about around the world today. Section 4. Heather Mack. The first three young women in this video came from small towns and modest homes. Heather Mack came from money. She grew up in Oak Park, a comfortable suburb just outside Chicago. Her father was James Mack, a respected jazz composer and musician, and her mother was Sheila von Weiss Mack, a wealthy and well-connected woman who moved in social circles most people only read about. The family had culture, money, and standing. But money cannot buy a happy home, and behind the comfortable front door, things were anything but peaceful. By the time Heather was still a child, her father had passed away, leaving Heather and her mother alone together, and the two of them did not get along, not even close. The relationship between Heather and Sheila was loud, bitter, and broken for years. Their fights were so frequent and so intense that police were called to their home dozens of times across Heather's childhood and teenage years. Think about how unusual that is. This was not a poor or chaotic household struggling to get by. It was a well-off family in a nice neighborhood, and yet officers kept ending up at their door because mother and daughter could not stop clashing. This was not the story of a loving parent and a grateful child. It was two people locked in a war that never seemed to end, living under the same roof and growing further apart every year, until the resentment between them had calcified into something dangerous. Into that storm walked a young man named Tommy Schaefer. He was 21, and he became Heather's boyfriend. Sheila could not stand him and did not want him anywhere near her daughter. The relationship became a fresh battleground in an already endless war. And then, to make an already tense situation explode, Heather, who was 18, became pregnant with Tommy's child. For Sheila, this was the final sign that her daughter's life was heading somewhere she desperately did not want it to go. The boyfriend she hated was now tied to her daughter for life, and the future she had imagined for Heather seemed to be slipping away completely. So Sheila made one last effort to fix things, and it is heartbreaking when you think about what she was trying to do. She booked a luxury vacation for the two of them to the island of Bali, in Indonesia, half a world away. They flew in business class and checked into the St. Regis, a 5-star resort in a beautiful upscale part of the island. In Sheila's mind, this was a chance to pull her daughter away from her troubles, to spend time together in paradise, and maybe to repair a bond that had been falling apart for years. She was spending a small fortune in a final, hopeful attempt to reach her child. It was, in every way, a mother trying to save her child. Heather had a very different plan for that trip, and it had nothing to do with making peace. Before they ever left, and even during the vacation, the scheme was taking shape through a phone. Heather wanted access to her mother's wealth, which included a trust fund reported to be worth around $1.5 million. That money was the prize, and Sheila was the only thing standing between Heather and it. Tommy Schaefer began texting his cousin back in the United States, a young man named Robert Bibbs, to talk through how they might end Sheila's life. These were not vague, angry words typed in a moment of frustration.
They were detailed, practical messages about how to actually do it. The three of them discussed different methods, even tossing around ideas like making it look like she had been smothered or had met with some kind of accident. At one point, weeks before the trip, Schaefer messaged that the whole thing would be done within a month, showing just how far ahead this had been planned. The cold calculation went further still. Heather had offered a large sum of money, reported to be tens of thousands of dollars, to get help with the plan. Bibbs, the cousin, went along with all of it because he expected to share in the fortune that would come Heather's way once her mother was gone. He even gave advice on how the couple might avoid getting caught by the police. And there was an early attempt that failed before the final one. While they were already in Bali, Schaefer tried to make Sheila sick by slipping something into her food, hoping that might be enough to do the job quietly. It was not. He messaged his cousin to say it had not worked and that they would need to do something more direct. What was supposed to be a healing trip for a mother and daughter had quietly become the setting for a carefully planned attack, one that had been rehearsed in text messages for weeks. There was also a smaller betrayal woven into all of this. Heather used her mother's own credit card to fly Tommy out to Bali and put him up at the hotel, spending a fortune of Sheila's money to bring along the very person her mother despised. When Sheila discovered that Tommy was there and that she had unknowingly paid for it, she was furious. The two of them had a public blow-up in the hotel lobby, a final, ugly argument in front of strangers. It was one of the last times anyone would see Sheila von Wiesmack alive. On August 12, 2014, inside Sheila's hotel room, the plan was carried out. Hotel security footage from earlier that day captured a haunting clue, showing Tommy Schaefer making his way toward Sheila's room with something hidden under his shirt. That something turned out to be the heavy metal handle of a decorative fruit bowl. Inside the room, Schaefer used that fruit bowl to strike Sheila, and she did not survive. According to what investigators and prosecutors later laid out, Heather was not a bystander to this. She helped, covering her mother's mouth while the attack happened. In a 5-star resort room, surrounded by marble and luxury, a daughter took part in ending the life of the woman who had brought her there to try to save her. Then came the part of this case that turned it into worldwide news, the part so strange that people still talk about it more than a decade later. Heather and Tommy needed to make Sheila disappear, so they took a large suitcase
and they hid her inside it.
This is the detail that earned the case its nickname all over the world: the suitcase killing. Their next move was almost unbelievable in how bold and how foolish it was. They wheeled the suitcase out of the hotel and loaded it into the trunk of a taxi waiting at the resort. They told the driver to wait for them. Then they walked back into the hotel and simply did not come back. They left the driver sitting there with the suitcase in his trunk and vanished, hoping to slip away from the whole thing and let someone else deal with the evidence. The taxi driver, of course, did not just sit there forever. He grew suspicious, especially when he noticed marks on the suitcase in his trunk. He went to the authorities. When police opened that suitcase, they found Sheila, the mother who had flown her daughter to paradise to try to mend their relationship, had been hidden away like a piece of luggage, abandoned in the back of a stranger's car. The hunt for Heather and Tommy did not last long.
The very next day, the pair were found hiding out at a cheaper hotel a short distance away, lying low and hoping the search would pass them by. And here is the moment that puts Heather Mack firmly on this list. When they were caught, they did not admit what they had done. Instead, they tried to pin it on someone else entirely. Their first story to authorities was that a group of local attackers had come after Sheila, that strangers were responsible, and that they themselves were innocent people caught up in something violent that had nothing to do with them. Once again, just like the daughters before her, Heather's instinct was to play the frightened bystander and point the blame somewhere far away from herself. The lie did not last. Police did not have to rely on guesswork because the entire plan had been typed out in black and white. The text messages between Tommy and his cousin Bibbs told the real story, step by step.
Investigators could see the discussion of how to do it, the failed earlier attempt with the food, the talk of money, and even the advice on dodging the police. There was no mystery group of local attackers. There was a daughter, her boyfriend, and a faraway cousin who had plotted this together for weeks. The made-up story collapsed under the weight of their own words. Heather Mack and Tommy Schaefer went on trial in Indonesia, and the case drew cameras and reporters from around the globe. The two of them changed their tune once the gang story fell apart. Schaefer admitted that he had been the one to strike Sheila, but he tried to claim he had acted to protect himself, insisting that Sheila had come at him first during a heated argument about Heather's pregnancy. It was a desperate attempt to soften what the evidence had already proven was a planned act. The court did not accept it. In 2015, both were convicted of planned, premeditated wrongdoing in Sheila's death. Because this was such a serious, deliberate crime, the two of them could have faced the most severe punishment Indonesia allows. In the end, the judges handed down prison terms instead. Tommy Schaefer was sentenced to 18 years. Heather received a shorter sentence of 10 years, in part because of something almost unbelievable in the middle of all this. She had just given birth. A daughter named Stella was born while Heather was behind bars in Bali. Under Indonesian rules, the little girl was allowed to stay with her mother in the prison until she turned 2 years old, and after that she was placed in the care of others on the island, growing up far from the family that had torn itself apart. The cousin who had advised them from thousands of miles away did not escape either. Robert Bibbs was prosecuted back in the United States. He admitted his role in helping plan the killing and was sentenced to 9 years in prison. He had hoped to share in a fortune. Instead, he shared in the punishment, all for a payout he would never see. For a while, it seemed Heather might serve her time and quietly move on. She was released early from her Indonesian sentence for good behaviour, having served about 7 years, and in 2021, she was deported back to the United States. But American authorities were waiting for her. The moment she arrived back in Chicago, she was arrested again, this time on federal charges, because conspiring to take the life of a United States citizen is something American courts can prosecute even when it happens on the other side of the world. The years she had already spent in a Bali prison were not going to be the end of her story. The American case ended the way the evidence had pointed all along. Heather Mack pleaded guilty to conspiring to end her mother's life in a foreign country. In January of 2024, a federal judge in Chicago sentenced her to 26 years in prison.
After credit for the time she had already spent locked up, she is still expected to serve many years more, likely not walking free again until she is well into middle age. The teenager who wanted her mother's money so badly that she helped hide her in a suitcase will spend the heart of her life paying for it, and the fortune she schemed to get became tangled in legal battles she sat in a cell to watch slip away. The story is not even fully closed today. Tommy Schaefer finished his sentence in Indonesia and was deported back to the United States in early 2026, where he was arrested mid-flight as his plane touched down in Chicago. He now faces his own federal trial, which means this case, more than a decade after that suitcase was found in a taxi trunk, is still moving through the courts. The little girl born in that Bali prison is growing up, while the adults who created her story are still answering for what they did.
What makes Heather Mack's story land so hard is the setting and the coldness of it all. This did not happen in a moment of rage in a small-town home. It happened on a tropical island, in a 5-star resort, on a trip her mother had paid for, in a last desperate hope of saving their relationship. Heather repaid that hope by helping to end her mother's life, and then trying to fold her up and roll her away in a suitcase. And when she was caught, her first words were not the truth. They were a story about strangers who never existed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Every daughter in this video so far has been, without question, the villain of her own story. The next case is different, and it is the one that splits people down the middle every single time it comes up. The young woman in our next section also helped end her mother's life, with the help of a boyfriend nobody approved of.
But before you decide how you feel about her, you need to know what her mother had been doing to her, in secret, for almost her entire life. Section 5. Gypsy Rose Blanchard. This is the case that breaks the pattern, and it is the one people will argue about long after the video ends. Every young woman we have looked at so far was, plainly and simply, the villain of her own story. With Gypsy Rose Blanchard, the line between victim and offender gets blurry, because before Gypsy ever did anything wrong, something deeply wrong had been done to her, every single day, for almost her entire life. To the outside world, Gypsy and her mother looked like one of the most sympathetic pairs you could imagine. Claudine Blanchard, who everyone called Dee Dee, was seen as a loving, tireless single mother, caring for a desperately sick child. Gypsy, who had moved with her mother from Louisiana to Springfield, Missouri, was presented to the community as a girl battling a long list of terrible illnesses.
She used a wheelchair. She had a feeding tube. Her head was often shaved, which made people assume she was going through cancer treatment. Neighbours, charities and strangers showered the two of them with kindness. They were given a home, trips, gifts, and endless sympathy. Dee Dee played the role of the devoted, suffering mum, and everyone believed her. Almost none of it was real. The truth was something called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. In plain language, it is a form of child mistreatment where a caregiver pretends a child is sick, or even makes the child sick on purpose, in order to soak up attention, sympathy, and support from everyone around them. That is exactly what Dee Dee did to Gypsy, and she did it for years. She told doctors and the world that her daughter had leukemia, muscular dystrophy, seizures, problems with her eyes and ears, and a long list of other conditions. None of it was true. Gypsy did not have those diseases. She did not need a wheelchair. She did not need a feeding tube. She could walk just fine. But Dee Dee made sure no one knew that. She put her daughter through years of medical treatments and operations that were never needed, including eye surgery and the removal of glands in her mouth. Gypsy was given medications she did not need, and over time her teeth rotted and fell out. To keep the lie going, Dee Dee, who had worked around hospitals, found ways to get hold of medicines that would create fake symptoms and fool doctors. She even lied about Gypsy's age, telling people her daughter was younger than she really was, so the image of a small, fragile, childlike patient would hold together. When Gypsy tried to act on her own or push back, she was punished and, at times, physically restrained. Gypsy grew up trapped inside a sickness that did not exist, performing it for an audience because her mother forced her to. You might be asking the obvious question: if Gypsy could actually walk, why didn't she just stand up one day and walk away? Why not show a doctor, a neighbour, anyone that she was fine? The answer is one of the saddest parts of this whole story. Gypsy had been controlled and isolated for so long that she truly believed no one would ever take her word over her mother's. Dee Dee was charming, convincing, and trusted by everyone. Gypsy had no money of her own, almost no contact with the outside world, and no real understanding of how to escape a person who had built an entire false reality around her. She had tried to get away once before, years earlier, and her mother had caught her and punished her for it. In Gypsy's mind, there was no normal exit. There was only the cage. The one place Dee Dee could not fully control was the internet. Gypsy managed to sneak online, and around 2012, she found her way onto a dating website meant for Christians. There she met a young man named Nicholas Godejohn, who lived in Wisconsin. The two began a secret relationship that would last roughly 3 years, all of it hidden from Dee Dee. Godejohn had his own serious struggles. His family later said he had been diagnosed with autism and had a history of dark, violent fantasies. For Gypsy, though, he was something she had never been allowed to have: a connection to another person, and a door that might lead out of her mother's house. For a while, the two of them dreamed about simply running away together and starting a new life. But the more Gypsy thought about escaping, the more impossible it seemed. She was sure her mother would track her down, drag her back, and the nightmare would start all over again. Slowly, in their messages, the talk shifted from running away to something far darker. They began to plan to remove Dee Dee from the picture for good. In Gypsy's mind, badly damaged by years of control, ending her mother's life had become the only way she could ever truly be free.
In June of 2015, they carried it out. Godejohn travelled from Wisconsin to Springfield, while Dee Dee was asleep in the home she shared with Gypsy. Gypsy let him in and handed him gloves, tape, and a knife. Then she went into the bathroom, shut the door, and covered her ears. While she hid, Godejohn went into the bedroom and used the knife on Dee Dee as she slept. Dee Dee did not survive. Afterward, the two of them took several $1,000s in cash from the house, cleaned up, and left. They made their way to Godejohn's home in Wisconsin, even mailing the knife away from Springfield so it would not be found at the scene. For a few days, no one had any idea what had happened. And here is where Gypsy Rose Blanchard fits the theme of this video, though in her own strange way. After the killing, a crude message appeared on the Facebook account that Gypsy shared with her mother, announcing that Dee Dee was gone. Friends who saw it were alarmed and called the police.
When officers went to check on the home, they found Dee Dee inside, but Gypsy was missing. Her wheelchair was still sitting in the house. To everyone who did not know the truth, this looked like a tragedy with two victims. People believed that a helpless, wheelchair-bound, terminally ill young woman had either been taken or harmed along with her mother. The community was heartbroken. A vigil was held, and people mourned for both Dee Dee and her supposedly fragile daughter. For that short window of time, Gypsy was seen as a victim of the very crime she had helped set in motion. The image her mother had spent years building, the sweet, sick girl who could not care for herself, briefly became the perfect disguise. That disguise did not survive contact with the facts. Investigators traced the online post back to Godejohn's home in Wisconsin, and on June 15, 2015, they arrested both Gypsy and Godejohn. The moment people saw Gypsy walking on her own, with no wheelchair and no sign of the illnesses she had supposedly battled her whole life, the entire story fell apart in an instant. The girl who could not walk was walking. The dying patient was healthy. And as investigators dug deeper, the real horror came into focus. This was not a fraud scheme gone wrong. This was a young woman who had been lied about and controlled by her own mother for as long as she could remember. It is worth being clear about Gypsy's own explanation for that Facebook post, because it adds yet another layer. She later said she made the message public not to brag, but because she wanted her mother to be found. She said she could not bear the thought of Dee Dee lying undiscovered for weeks or months, and she wanted her to be found and given a proper burial. Whether you believe that or not, it is part of what makes this case so hard to sort out. Even in the middle of something terrible, the picture is not simple.
When the courts dealt with the case, they clearly took the years of mistreatment into account. Godejohn, the one who actually used the knife, was convicted of first-degree wrongdoing and sentenced to life behind bars with no chance of release. Gypsy, however, was offered a very different outcome. She pleaded guilty to a lesser charge in 2016 and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. That much lighter sentence was a direct reflection of everything that had been done to her, and a recognition that she was not a cold planner in the way the other young women in this video were. She had been shaped, twisted, and trapped by her abuser, who happened to be the very person she helped end. Gypsy served about 8 years and was released on parole in December of 2023, walking out of prison to a world that had been following her story obsessively. By then, her case had become one of the most talked about in the country, the subject of documentaries and a hit television series.
And the public was, and still is, deeply divided about her.
Some people see Gypsy Rose Blanchard as a true victim who finally snapped after a lifetime of unimaginable mistreatment, a young woman who did a terrible thing only because every other escape route had been sealed shut. Others argue that since she could walk, she always had a way out. They point out that she could have exposed her mother's lies by simply standing up in a doctor's office or telling the truth to any of the many people who tried to help her, and that choosing to end a life crossed a line that suffering cannot fully excuse. Both sides have a point, and that tension is exactly why her name still sparks arguments today. Where Gypsy truly stands apart from everyone else in this video is in who told the biggest lies. With Jennifer Pan, Sarah Johnson, Erin Caffey, and Heather Mack, the daughter built the deception, staged the scene, and tried to fool the police. With Gypsy, the lifelong devastating lie was told by her mother about her for years, and Gypsy was the one trapped inside it. Her own deception of the public was brief, and once she was caught, she largely told the truth about what happened. She did not spin an elaborate story to detectives. The mask she wore on the day her mother was found was not even one she had designed. It was the same false image of the helpless, sick girl that her mother had forced onto her since childhood. In a video full of daughters who lied, Gypsy Rose Blanchard is the one who spent most of her life being lied about, until she helped end the person doing the lying. That makes her story uncomfortable in a way the others are not. It is easy to feel pure anger at a teenager who has her family attacked over a boyfriend. It is much harder to know what to feel about a young woman who was robbed of her childhood, her health, and her freedom, and who responded to that in the worst possible way.
There are no clean heroes here, and depending on how you look at it, there may not be a single clean villain either, except perhaps the mother who started it all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So far, every young woman in this video has been a teenager or older. The next case takes us somewhere even more disturbing, to someone so young that the country where it happened struggled to believe she was capable of it at all. She was barely into adolescence. She had an older influence in her life, encouraging destructive ideas, and what she helped do would make her the youngest person ever found responsible for such a case in her entire nation. Section 6. Jasmine Richardson. Every young woman in this video so far has been at least a teenager, old enough to drive, date, and understand exactly what she was doing. The person in this section was none of those things. She was still very young. She was a child in the 6th grade, the kind of age where most kids are worried about homework and sleepovers. And yet what she helped do to her own family was so brutal that it made history in her country for all the worst reasons. Her name is Jasmine Richardson, and she lived in Medicine Hat, a small, quiet city on the Canadian prairie in the province of Alberta. By every account, the Richardsons were a normal, loving family. Her father, Mark, and her mother, Deborah, were devoted parents. She had a little brother who was just 8 years old. For most of her childhood, Jasmine was a good student and an ordinary, happy girl, the type no one would ever look at twice. Up until around the age of 10, there was nothing about her that hinted at what was coming. Then she got online,
and she began to change. Her style shifted toward a dark, gothic look. Her interests turned strange and unsettling for a child her age. On her internet profile, she listed her fascination with disturbing figures, including a notorious real-life killer. The sweet kid her parents knew was slowly being replaced by someone they did not recognize. And then she met a man who would push that change all the way over the edge. His name was Jeremy Steinke, and he was 23 years old. Let that sink in for a moment. He was a grown adult of 23, and she was 12. That alone tells you something was deeply wrong before any crime ever happened. They met at a punk rock show and stayed in contact online. Steinke was a troubled person who had built a bizarre fantasy identity for himself. He told people he was a 300-year-old creature of the night, something like a werewolf, and he wore a small vial around his neck to go along with the act. To a lonely, impressionable 12-year-old, this strange older boy seemed exciting and dangerous in a thrilling way. To everyone with any sense, he was an adult who had no business being anywhere near a child. Mark and Deborah Richardson saw the danger immediately. They did the right thing, the thing any caring parents would do. They told Jasmine that she was not allowed to see Steinke. The age gap alone was alarming, and they wanted to protect their daughter from a man who was clearly bad news. But just like the parents in the cases before this one, their attempt to protect their child set off something they could never have imagined. Jasmine did not accept their decision. Instead, she began to think about getting rid of the obstacle in her way, and the obstacle was her own family. According to what investigators later uncovered, it was actually Jasmine who first brought up the idea of removing her parents. She sent Steinke a message laying out a plan, telling him that it would start with her ending her parents and end with the two of them living together. Steinke went along with it and even encouraged her to work out more of the details. Jasmine talked about the plan to some of her friends, but they did not take her seriously. They figured a 12-year-old talking about something so dark could not possibly mean it. They were tragically wrong. There was real planning behind this, not just angry words. Later, police would find a drawing inside Jasmine's school locker, a simple stick figure picture that coldly showed her family being attacked. This was not a sudden burst of rage. It was something she had been imagining and preparing for. The night before it happened, Steinke and some friends sat down and watched a famous violent film about a young couple who go on a killing spree together, a story Steinke seemed to admire and want to copy. On the night of April 23, 2006, in that quiet home on a normal residential street, the plan became real. Jeremy Steinke came to the house wearing a mask and carrying a knife. He went down into the basement where he encountered Jasmine's mother, Deborah. He attacked her. Her husband, Mark, heard the commotion and rushed to help his wife, even trying to fight back, but he was overpowered. Both of Jasmine's parents lost their lives in that basement. When Mark, in his final moments, asked why this was happening to him, Steinke gave a chilling answer. He said it was what their daughter wanted. But the parents were not the only ones in the house that night. Jasmine's little brother, just 8 years old, was upstairs asleep in his bed. What happened to him is the most disturbing part of this entire case, and to this day, there are two versions of it. Jasmine later claimed that Steinke ordered her to be the one to harm her brother. Steinke, on the other hand, testified that he simply stood in the doorway and watched while Jasmine did it herself. The two of them pointed fingers at each other over who was responsible for the youngest, most helpless person in the home. What the law decided, in the end, was that Jasmine was responsible for all 3 lives lost, including her baby brothers. What they did afterward is almost as disturbing as the crime itself. Witnesses reported seeing Jasmine and Steinke shortly after, at a restaurant, laughing and kissing like any other young couple out on a date. There was no panic, no horror, no sign of what they had just done. Then the two of them fled together, leaving the home and its terrible secrets behind.
The discovery came in a way that is heartbreaking on its own. The next day, a young boy in the neighbourhood, a friend of Jasmine's little brother, went over to the house to play. Through a window, he thought he saw a body on the ground. Frightened, he ran home and told his mother, who called the police. When officers arrived and looked through a basement window, they saw the awful scene inside.
One of the first to respond was a local inspector, who would later say it took him years to recover from the image of the little boy found in his bed.
The two parents were in the basement, the child was upstairs, and the family's 12-year-old daughter, Jasmine, was nowhere to be found. This is the moment that connects Jasmine to the rest of this video, even though her version of deception is a quieter one. With Jasmine missing from a home where everyone else had been attacked, the natural fear was that she too was a victim. People worried she had been taken, that some intruder had harmed the whole family and kidnapped the young girl. For a short time, she was seen not as a suspect, but as a possible victim of the very crime she had helped plan. While the community feared for her safety, Jasmine was actually on the run with the grown man she had schemed with. A manhunt began, and it did not take long.
Just a couple of days later, Jasmine and Steinke were tracked down and arrested in the town of Leader, in the neighbouring province of Saskatchewan, more than 100 kilometres away from the home. They had even had help getting away, from another person who later admitted to assisting them and received a sentence of house arrest for it. The girl who had vanished was found alive and well, far from home, beside the older boyfriend her parents had tried so hard to keep away. Once she was in custody, Jasmine's deception shifted from disappearing to denying. She pleaded not guilty. When her case went to trial, her defense tried to paint her as a child who had been swept along by a manipulative older man, suggesting she had not truly meant the things she said and that Steinke had controlled her. There is some truth to the idea that a grown adult preying on a 12-year-old holds real power over her, and her young age and that toxic relationship were genuine factors. But the evidence told a harder story. Her own messages showed that she had proposed the plan in the first place. The drawing in her locker showed she had thought about it ahead of time. Witnesses came forward to say that both Jasmine and Steinke had admitted to what they did. The picture of a girl who was merely along for the ride did not hold up. She had been a willing planner, not just a passenger. The trials gripped all of Canada for months. Because Jasmine was so young, the law kept her name out of the public eye during the proceedings, and for a long time she was known only by her initials. But her age made the case impossible to forget. A jury found her responsible on 3 counts of the most serious wrongdoing the law recognizes, one for each member of her family. With that, Jasmine Richardson became the youngest person in Canadian history ever found responsible for multiple counts of that top-level crime. A 12-year-old had earned a place in the darkest record books her country keeps. The way the two of them were punished could not have been more different, and it comes down entirely to age. Jeremy Steinke, the adult, was tried as an adult. He was found responsible for all 3 lives and handed life sentences with no chance to even ask for release for 25 years. He later changed his name and remains behind bars. Jasmine, because she was only 12 at the time, faced a completely different system. Under the rules for young offenders in Canada, the maximum she could be given was 10 years. That time was split up, with a stretch in custody, a period in a psychiatric facility for treatment, and a long final phase under supervision in the community. 3 people had lost their lives, and the person who helped plan it would be free again within a decade. And free she became. Jasmine completed her sentence in 2016 when she was in her early 20s. By many accounts, she had responded well to treatment, expressed genuine remorse, attended university, and worked hard to turn her life around. Today, she lives somewhere in Canada under a new identity, walking among the public, her record cleared after her rehabilitation. Not everyone is at peace with that. The inspector who had stood at that home in 2006 admitted his biggest fear was that she had simply learned to say the right things, that she had fooled the very system meant to fix her
and that the change in her might not be real. There is no way to know for certain. That uncertainty is part of what makes her case linger in people's minds. When you step back and look at Jasmine Richardson next to the others, what sets her apart is not a clever staged scene or a polished lie to detectives. It is her age. It is almost impossible to wrap your head around the idea of someone so young sitting down, sketching out a plan, and then helping to carry it out against the very people who raised and cared for her, including a younger sibling who had done nothing but exist. Her deception was simpler than the others. She let the world fear she was a missing victim while she ran off with an older individual, and then she tried to convince a court that she had been nothing more than a confused young person caught up in someone else's wrongdoing. The facts said otherwise, and while a sad and twisted relationship with an older influence clearly shaped her, the law decided that the youngest person involved was not as innocent as her age might suggest. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case brings us back across the border into the United States, and back to a pattern we have now seen again and again. A young girl, a much older boyfriend, and a parent who tried to put a stop to it. But this time, when the questions started and the pressure mounted, the young couple did something the others did not. Instead of holding their story together, they turned on each other. Section 7. Tyler Witt. In the comfortable California community of El Dorado Hills, near Sacramento, a single mother named Joanne Witt was raising her teenage daughter on her own. Joanne was 47, hard-working, and held down a steady job with the local county. By all accounts, she was a devoted mum, doing her best to bring up her only child, 14-year-old Tyler, without a partner to lean on. She had no idea that the choices she would make to protect her daughter would cost Joanne her own life, and that her daughter would be part of the reason why. The trouble started, as it has in so many of these stories, with an older individual. His name was Stephen Culver, though he went by the nickname Boston. The two of them got involved in an inappropriate relationship, and for a time, Culver was even allowed to stay around the Witt household. But the situation alone was a serious problem, and once Joanne began to understand just how deep the relationship went, she knew she had to act. The moment everything changed came when Joanne discovered her daughter's diary. Inside, written in Tyler's own hand, were detailed entries describing a relationship that crossed clear boundaries. For a mother, this was a nightmare. An older individual had become involved with her young daughter, and that created serious legal and ethical concerns. Joanne did exactly what a responsible parent is supposed to do. She threw Culver out of the house and she went to the police to report him, telling them that this grown man had been in an unlawful relationship with her underage child. Culver denied everything, even claiming that Tyler was like a sister to him, but Joanne now had proof, and that proof put Culver in real danger of going to prison. The situation came to a head in the days that followed. A sheriff's deputy came to the Witt home to take a statement from Tyler. When Tyler stuck to an innocent story and refused to tell the truth, Joanne made the hard decision to hand the deputy her daughter's private diary as evidence. To Joanne, this was about justice and protecting her child from a predator. To Tyler, it felt like the end of the world. She understood immediately that with the diary now in police hands, there was almost no way Culver could avoid serious charges. She fell apart, panicking at the thought of losing him to prison. Before this, Tyler and Culver had talked about something dark and dramatic. Like the doomed young couple in the famous Shakespeare play Romeo and Juliet, they had spoken about running away together to San Francisco and ending their own lives, treating their love as something the world would never allow. It was the kind of intense, tragic fantasy that troubled teenagers sometimes spin. But once the diary was in police hands and Culver's freedom was on the line, that fantasy curdled into something far more real and far more sinister. Instead of turning on themselves, they decided to turn on the one person standing in their way. They would remove Joanne. On the night of June 11th, 2009, the plan was carried out. Tyler made sure her mother was asleep, and then she let Stephen Culver into the home. Joanne was attacked in her own bed and harmed many times with a large kitchen knife that Culver had taken from the restaurant where he worked. Joanne Witt, the mother who had tried so hard to do the right thing, did not survive. As for Tyler, she later described her own role in a way meant to distance herself from the worst of it.
She testified that she stood outside the bedroom door, put her hands over her ears, closed her eyes, and hummed to herself so she would not have to hear what was happening to her mother just a few feet away. With Joanne gone, the young couple did exactly what they had once fantasized about. They fled towards San Francisco to follow through on their pact to end their own lives together. That attempt failed, and both of them survived. So now there were two teenagers on the run, the older boyfriend and the 14-year-old daughter, drifting through the Bay Area, while back home, Joanne lay undiscovered. The discovery came through Joanne's job. When she did not show up for work and could not be reached, her supervisor grew worried and contacted both the authorities and Joanne's own parents. That call set everything in motion. When officers checked the home, they found Joanne, and what had looked like a missing person concern instantly became something far worse. The hunt for Tyler and Culver did not take long. Investigators caught a break when Culver's car turned up abandoned in San Francisco. Using that as a thread to pull, they tracked the pair down. A few days after Joanne's life was taken, police in the city of San Bruno, just south of San Francisco, found the two teenagers at a shopping area, changing their clothes behind a dumpster, like fugitives trying to shed their old identities. The runaway lovers were finally in custody. Now we reach the part that makes Tyler Witt's case stand out from the others in this video. Up to this point, you have seen daughters who staged crime scenes, daughters who claimed an intruder did it, and daughters who pretended to be kidnapped. Tyler's deception followed a familiar opening note.
At first, she claims that she and Culver had nothing to do with her mother's death at all. She tried to wear the same innocent mask we have seen again and again. But what happened next was different, and it is the reason this case is so revealing about how these partnerships fall apart under pressure. Once they were caught and the questions began, Tyler and Stephen Culver did not protect each other. They turned on each other. Each one pointed the finger at the other as the real culprit. Culver told his version, claiming that on the night it happened, he had simply come to pick Tyler up to drive away together, and that when he arrived, Joanne was already gone. According to Culver, he found Tyler holding a kitchen knife, and she admitted to him that she had done it, telling him that her mother was gone forever. Tyler told the opposite story, insisting that Culver was the one who went into the bedroom and carried out the attack, while she waited outside with her hands over her ears.
The two young people who had once compared themselves to history's most famous tragic lovers were now each trying to send the other down for the crime they had committed together. The evidence helped sort out the truth. Investigators had found genetic material from Stephen Culver under Joanne Witt's fingernails, which placed him in direct physical contact with her during the attack. Prosecutors concluded that Culver was the one who actually used the knife, while Tyler was the one who let him in and made the whole thing possible. In their view, this was not one person's crime. It was a team effort, with Tyler opening the door, both literally and in every other sense, to her mother's killer. In the end, Tyler Witt chose to save herself. She agreed to a deal with prosecutors. She would plead guilty and, crucially, she would testify against Stephen Culver, the boyfriend she had supposedly been willing to die for. In exchange, her own punishment would be reduced.
Originally, she faced the most serious charge, which carried added weight because the killing was seen partly as a way to silence the person who had reported Culver to police. But under her deal, that was lowered, and she was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. Stephen Culver, who took his case to trial, was convicted of the most serious charge and sentenced to life behind bars with no possibility of release. The girl who had once whispered about dying alongside him now sat in a courtroom, helping to lock him away forever. The people left behind were Joanne's parents, the grandparents who had lost their daughter, and, in a sense, their granddaughter on the same terrible night. At the sentencing, Joanne's father spoke with raw pain, blaming Culver for everything that his granddaughter had become and for taking his daughter from him. There was no winner in that courtroom. Only a family shattered by a 14-year-old's choices and a 19-year-old's actions. Tyler's story did not end in a cell forever. Because she was so young when it happened, and because she had cooperated, she became eligible for release after serving her minimum time. She was granted parole and walked free,
returning to society as a young woman with the rest of her life ahead of her, something her mother will never have. What makes the Tyler Witt case so heartbreaking is the role her mother played in it. Joanne Witt was not a controlling or cruel parent. She was a mother who found out that an adult man had been preying on her teenage daughter, and she did precisely what we would all hope a parent would do. She reported him. She protected her child. She tried to put a stop to something dangerous and wrong, and for doing the right thing, she lost her life, betrayed by the very daughter she was trying to save. Tyler's lies came in layers. She lied to her mother about the relationship. She lied to the deputy who came to take her statement. She lied to police after she was caught. And finally, when it suited her, she even turned her lies against the boyfriend she had claimed to love more than life itself. In a video full of betrayals, Tyler Witt managed to betray almost everyone in her story. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So far, every young woman we have looked at made her own choice. Each one decided, on her own or with a partner, to do something monstrous. The next case is different in a way that genuinely complicates how you feel about it. It involves a 14-year-old girl who carried out the act with her own hands and then lied to the police about it, but who did so only because someone she trusted completely had spent months quietly moulding her into a weapon and then arranged for her to take the blame while he walked away clean.
Section 8. Cinnamon Brown. Every young woman in this video so far made a choice that was, in the end, her own. This case is the one that forces you to think harder, because the 14-year-old at the centre of it did pull the trigger and did lie to police, yet she may be as much a victim as anyone she harmed. To understand why, you have to understand the man who was really pulling the strings. The story takes place in Garden Grove in Orange County, California, in the spring of 1985. At the heart of it was a man named David Brown. On the surface, David looked like a success story. He ran a profitable computer business that recovered lost data. He had money, and he could be charming and generous. But underneath that polished image was something far darker. David Brown was a manipulator who collected young, vulnerable girls and bent them to his will, and the people living in his home would pay a terrible price for it. His household was unusual and deeply troubling.
The trouble started, as it has in so many of these stories, with an older individual. His name was Stephen Culver, though he went by the nickname Boston. The two of them became closely associated, and for a time, Culver was even allowed to stay around the Witt household. But the situation alone was a serious problem, and once Joanne began to understand how involved things had become, she knew she had to act. The moment everything changed came when Joanne discovered her daughter's diary. Inside, written in Tyler's own hand, were detailed entries describing circumstances that deeply concerned her family. For a mother, this was a nightmare. An older individual had become a major influence in her daughter's life, and that created serious concerns. Joanne did exactly what a responsible parent is supposed to do.
With Linda out of the picture, David could collect the insurance and replace his wife with her own teenage sister. The problem for David was obvious. If his wife died and he benefited from it, he would be the first and most likely suspect. He needed someone else to do it, and he needed someone else to take the blame. So he turned to the two young girls he had under his control, and he went to work on their minds. Over months, David convinced both Cinnamon and Patty that Linda was a threat, telling them she was dangerous and plotting against him and the family. He twisted their view of reality until these teenagers believed that getting rid of Linda was somehow necessary to protect the man they trusted. And then he focused on his own daughter with an especially cruel lie. He convinced 14-year-old Cinnamon that because she was just a child, the law could not really punish her. He told her that if she was the one to do it, she would barely face any consequences at all. In David's plan, his young daughter would carry out the act, take the fall, and walk away more or less free, while he collected the money and kept his hands clean. The plan was set in motion in the early hours of March 19th, 1985. Past midnight, David woke the girls and told them the time had come, that it had to happen that night. He handed his 14-year-old daughter a firearm. While Linda lay sleeping in her bed, Cinnamon used the firearm on her, firing twice, using a pillow to muffle the sound. The second shot was the fatal one. Linda Brown, just 23 years old, did not survive, and her infant daughter was left without a mother. David, meanwhile, had made sure to leave the house, setting up an excuse for where he had been, so that no one could tie him to what happened inside. The plan did not stop at the killing. David had coached his daughter to make it look like she had then tried to harm herself out of guilt. Cinnamon took a large amount of pills that her father had given her and wrote a note he had told her to write, a note expressing sorrow and asking for forgiveness. When authorities arrived at the home, after David called them claiming he had found his wife wounded, they made a strange and disturbing discovery. They found 14-year-old Cinnamon outside in the backyard, collapsed and unconscious inside the family's doghouse, sick from the pills, with that note nearby. She survived, and from that haunting image, the case earned the nickname it still carries, the story of the girl in the doghouse. David Brown played his part perfectly. He told police he had left the home earlier that night because he was tired of the constant arguing between his wife and his daughter. He presented himself as a grieving, blindsided husband who had no idea his troubled teenager was capable of such a thing. It was a convincing performance from a man who had spent months planning every detail.
Here is where Cinnamon Brown fits the theme of this video and where her case becomes so painful. Cinnamon confessed to the shooting. She did not deny that she had been the one to do it, but she lied about the most important part. She insisted over and over that she had acted completely on her own. She protected her father exactly the way he had trained her to. She said nothing about his planning, nothing about his orders, nothing about the months of manipulation. As far as the police were told, this was a troubled girl who had clashed with her stepmother and snapped. The real architect of the whole thing, her own father, was left standing in the clear, just as he had designed. The courts took Cinnamon at her word. In 1986, she was convicted and sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. Because of her age, she was sent to a California Youth Authority facility rather than an adult prison. The lie David had told her, that her youth would protect her from punishment, turned out to be exactly that, a lie. She was a child facing decades behind bars for a crime her father had engineered, while he prepared to enjoy the rewards. And enjoy them he did, for a while. With Linda gone and Cinnamon locked away taking the blame, David collected hundreds of thousands of dollars from the life insurance policies. He bought a fine home and lived in luxury. In 1986, he secretly married Patty, the teenage sister-in-law he had groomed for years, and the two of them had a child together. To the outside world, the case was closed. A jealous, unstable stepdaughter had committed a terrible act and was paying for it, and the heartbroken widower was simply trying to move on with his life. But not everyone believed the tidy version of events. An investigator named Jay Newell could not shake his doubts. Something about the case did not sit right with him. The girl in custody was reportedly well-behaved and did not seem like a cold-blooded planner. Meanwhile, the husband had walked away with a fortune and had married his dead wife's young sister with suspicious speed. To Newell, the pieces pointed in a direction no one had wanted to look. He kept the case alive in his mind and waited for an opportunity. That opportunity came from Cinnamon herself. By 1988, 3 years into her sentence, the world her father had promised her had completely collapsed. She had not been quietly released as he had assured her. Her requests for parole were denied, and worst of all, her father's visits grew fewer and farther between as he lived in comfort with Patty on the money that came from the death Cinnamon had taken the blame for. Slowly the truth dawned on the young woman in that cell. She had not been protected. She had been used and then abandoned by the one person she had trusted enough to sacrifice her own freedom for. When investigators came to her, now that she was no longer a small child, Cinnamon was finally ready to talk. She agreed to help them. In a remarkable move, she allowed her conversations with her father to be secretly recorded during his prison visits. David, not knowing he was being taped, talked in ways that exposed his role in the whole scheme. His own words became the evidence that brought him down. David Brown was arrested in 1988. True to his nature, the moment he was charged, he tried to shove the blame onto someone else, pointing the finger at Patty. But Patty, like Cinnamon, had reached the end of her loyalty. She came forward with her own account, describing the years of abuse she had suffered at David's hands since childhood, and laying out how he had planned and directed the killing. 2 young women he had manipulated and discarded now stood together against him. In 1990, David Brown was convicted and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of release. He spent the rest of his days behind bars and died there in 2014. Patty, too, faced legal consequences for her part and cooperated in bringing David to justice. As for Cinnamon, she served about 7 years in the youth facility before she was paroled in 1992. She had given up years of her young life for a crime that, while committed by her hand, was conceived entirely in her father's mind. What makes Cinnamon Brown's case so different from the others in this video is the question of who the real villain is. She is not innocent. She held the firearm. She used it on a sleeping woman who had done her no harm, and she lied to the police afterward to hide what had truly happened. Those are real and serious facts, and Linda Brown lost her life because of them. But Cinnamon was also a very young girl who had been carefully influenced and shaped by a deeply manipulative father, a man who fed her falsehoods, took advantage of her trust, and then set her up to face the consequences while he benefited. Her lie to police was not a clever scheme to save herself, like the staged break-ins and false intruders we have seen in other cases. It was the final act of obedience to a controlling influence, a lie he had planted in her long before events reached their conclusion. She confessed to everything, except the one thing that would have pointed at him. In a video full of daughters who turned on their families out of selfishness, anger, or greed, Cinnamon Brown is the daughter who was shaped into a tool by the very person who was supposed to protect her. She lied to the police, yes, but the man who handed her the script for that lie was sitting at home, benefiting from the outcome, while his own child faced the consequences. It is one of the few stories here where you can feel genuine sympathy for the young woman who committed the act, even as you never forget the life that was taken because of it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes us to Texas, and to a completely different kind of young woman. There was no manipulative father pulling strings, and no boyfriend whispering in her ear. There was just a quiet, brilliant honor student, a high school chemistry class, and a plan so clever and so cold that the death she caused was written off as natural for nearly 2 years. She did not need to lie to the police at all, because for a long time, the police never even knew a crime had taken place. Section 9. Marie Robards. This case is unlike every other one in this video, and in some ways it is the most chilling, precisely because it is so quiet. There was no hired team, like with Jennifer Pan. There was no older boyfriend whispering in her ear, like with so many of the others. There was no manipulative father pulling the strings, like with Cinnamon Brown. There was just one teenage girl, alone, with a terrible idea, a high school chemistry lab, and the patience to wait. And for almost 2 years, she very nearly got away with it completely. Her name was Marie Robards, and she did not fit anyone's picture of a dangerous person. She was 16 years old, living in Fort Worth, Texas, and by every account, she was a model student. She was smart, hard-working, polite, and reserved. She got excellent grades, finished her assignments on time, and stayed out of the kind of trouble most teenagers find. She was the type of quiet, focused young woman teachers love to have in class, and parents wish their own kids would be more like. Nothing on the surface hinted that she was capable of what she did. To understand what happened, you have to go back to her childhood and a broken home. Marie's parents had divorced when she was very young. After the split, her mother eventually remarried and built a new life, while Marie ended up moving back and forth between her two parents over the years. By the early 1990s, the arrangement had settled into something Marie deeply disliked. She was living with her father, Stephen Robards, a man in his late 30s, in an apartment in the Fort Worth area while she attended high school, and living with her father was the last thing Marie wanted. This is where the case becomes so coldly unsettling. In most of the stories in this video, the daughter lashed out because a parent forbade a relationship, or because of abuse, or because someone manipulated her. With Marie, the reason was simpler and, in a way, more disturbing. She did not want to live with her dad. She wanted to live with her mother. There was no evidence that her father had mistreated her or done anything cruel. He was, as far as anyone could tell, an ordinary father. Marie simply felt trapped in a living situation she could not stand, and instead of running away, calling a lawyer, or waiting out the time until she turned 18, she settled on a far darker solution. If her father was gone, she reasoned, she would finally get to live with her mum. Once that idea took hold, Marie did something that showed just how calculating she could be. In her high school chemistry lab sat a supply of various chemicals, the kind students use for experiments. Among them was a substance called barium acetate. In the right amount, it is deadly to a human being. It is also very difficult to detect after the fact, which is exactly what made it so dangerous in the hands of someone who knew what she was doing. Marie quietly took some of it. She did not tell anyone. She simply carried that deadly chemical home and waited for her moment. That moment came in February of 1993. Marie mixed the barium acetate into her father's dinner that evening, a meal of Mexican food.
Stephen Robards ate it without any idea what had been hidden inside. Not long after, he became suddenly and violently ill. Marie went to a neighbour, a woman named Sandra Hudgens, for help. While the neighbour rushed to check on Stephen, Marie stayed behind, keeping company with the neighbour's son. By the time it was over, Stephen Robards, only in his late 30s, was gone. To everyone watching, it looked like a healthy man in the prime of his life had been struck down out of nowhere. Now we come to the part of this story that makes Marie Robards so different from every other young woman in this video. The others all had to lie to the police. They staged break-ins, blamed strangers, claimed kidnappings, or pointed fingers at their partners. Marie never had to lie to the police at all, for one simple and frightening reason. The police never even knew a crime had happened. When a relatively young man dies suddenly, doctors look for an obvious cause, and the most common assumption is the heart. The local coroner examined Stephen Robards and concluded that he had died of a heart attack, a natural death. Case closed. And here is the detail that allowed Marie's plan to work so well. To detect an unusual poison like barium acetate, a medical examiner's office needed a very specialised and expensive machine, a piece of equipment costing well over $100,000, which the local office simply did not have. Without that machine, there was no routine way to find the chemical in his system, so no one looked for it. No one suspected it. Stephen Robards was buried, his death recorded as natural, and his 16-year-old daughter walked away from the perfect crime. Marie did not lie to investigators because there were no investigators. Her deception was something quieter and, in its own way, more chilling. It was the deception of silence. She kept the secret completely. She went on with her life as though nothing had happened, attending school, earning her grades, and saying nothing to anyone about what she had done. After her father's death, Marie received around $60,000 from his life insurance. She used that money to help pay for college. She enrolled at the University of Texas, where she planned to study to become a pathologist, the very kind of doctor whose job is to examine bodies and determine how people died. A young woman who was hiding the true cause of her own father's death was preparing for a career built on uncovering exactly that kind of truth. The irony of it is hard to overstate. For nearly a year, the secret held perfectly. Marie carried it inside her, calm on the outside, while the world believed her father had simply suffered a tragic medical event. If she had kept her mouth shut forever, there is a very real chance she would never have been caught. No detective was working the case. No forensic test was coming.
The only thing standing between Marie Robards and a lifetime of freedom was Marie herself. And in the end, that turned out to be enough. The crack appeared in January of 1994, during Marie's senior year of high school, and it came from the most unexpected place imaginable. Marie and one of her closest friends, a popular girl named Stacy, were studying together for an English class. The subject that night was one of Shakespeare's most famous plays, Hamlet. If you know the play, you know that it contains a notorious storyline in which a man poisons his own brother, the king, in order to take what he wants. As the two girls worked through that part of the play, something in Marie shifted. The story of a secret poisoning struck far too close to home, and the weight of what she had been carrying for almost a year finally pushed its way out. There, while studying a centuries-old play about a hidden poisoning, Marie quietly confessed to her friend that she had poisoned her own father. You can only imagine what that did to Stacy. In an instant, she went from being a normal teenager studying for class to being the only other person on Earth who knew a horrifying secret. And she did not know what to do with it. At first, she tried to keep it to herself, the way a loyal friend might want to protect someone they care about. But a secret that heavy does not stay buried easily. As the months passed and Stacy moved on to college at Sam Houston State University, the guilt ate at her. Her grades fell. Her mental health crumbled. She was tormented by the knowledge of what Marie had done and by the feeling that Stephen Robards was somehow reaching out from beyond, asking her to do something about it. She suffered what amounted to a complete breakdown under the strain. After roughly 8 months of carrying that burden, Stacy could not take it any longer. She finally went to a school counselor and told the truth, and from there, it reached the police. That single decision made by a guilt-ridden young woman who could not live with what she knew is the only reason Marie Robards was ever caught. It was not brilliant detective work. It was not a forensic breakthrough. It was a conscience, just not Marie's own. Once the tip reached investigators, they faced a real challenge. The death had already been ruled natural. Stephen Robards had been buried for a long time. To prove a crime, they would need to test his remains for barium, and they would need to do it before the preserved samples from his original autopsy were destroyed, which was nearly the case. They managed to recover the samples just in time. Then they had to find a laboratory that actually owned the specialized, expensive equipment needed to detect the chemical, the very kind of machine that had been missing back when his death was first examined. When the results finally came back in October of 1994, they were stunning. Stephen Robards' body contained an enormous amount of barium, hundreds of times more than would ever be found in a normal person. There was no natural explanation for it. The medical examiner, Dr. Nizam Pirwani, officially changed the cause of death. What had been recorded for nearly 2 years as a heart attack was now reclassified as a crime. The perfect crime was no longer perfect. With the science finally catching up to the truth, police moved on Marie. By this time, she was a freshman at the University of Texas in Austin, living the studious, promising life she had built on top of her secret. A detective traveled to take statements, including from Stacy, and then Marie was arrested. At the police station in Austin, the polished honor student did not put up a long fight or invent a wild story. She quickly admitted to what she had done. When she explained why, her reason was as cold and as simple as it had always been. She told them she had wanted to live with her mother. There is one more detail from that interview that says a great deal. The detective questioning her, perhaps searching for some understandable explanation, asked her again and again whether her father had ever abused her or done something terrible to her that might have driven her to it. Each time, Marie said no. There was no hidden history of cruelty to excuse what she had done. She had not struck back at a monster. She had removed an ordinary father because she preferred a different home address. That absence of any real justification is what makes her case linger in the mind. When her case went to trial in 1995, Marie pleaded not guilty. Her defense tried to soften what had happened by arguing that she had never meant to take her father's life at all, that she had only intended to make him sick. It was a hard argument to accept, given the enormous and clearly deadly amount of the chemical involved, and the jury did not buy it. Marie Robards was convicted. She was sentenced to nearly 3 decades behind bars, a stunning fall for a girl who had once seemed destined for college and a respectable career. She ended up serving about 8 years before she was released on parole in 2003. Today, she is believed to live quietly under a new identity, her past hidden once again, this time legally. What sets Marie Robards apart from everyone else in this video is the nature of her deception and just how close it came to working forever. The other young women were caught because their lies fell apart, because a parent survived, because evidence was found in the trash, or because they turned on each other. Marie's lie never fell apart on its own. There was no surviving witness, no smoking weapon, no staged scene for police to pick apart, because the police were never even looking. Her crime was so quiet and so cleverly chosen that it sailed past doctors and coroners and got written off as an act of nature. The single thing that brought her down was her own guilt, leaking out on an ordinary night over the pages of an old play. Had she simply stayed silent, the way she had stayed silent for almost 2 years, Stephen Robards might still be remembered only as a man who died too young of a bad heart. And that is perhaps the most disturbing lesson hidden in this case. Marie Robards reminds us that some of these crimes are not undone by clever investigators or by science alone. Sometimes the only thing standing between a person and a perfect crime is whether they can live with themselves afterward. Marie almost could. For a long stretch of time she went to school, made plans for her future, and spent her father's insurance money, all while sitting on a secret that should have torn most people apart. In the end it tore at her too, but slowly, and only after she had nearly escaped it entirely. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. For our final case, we leave the United States behind and cross the ocean to England, to a small, quiet town where 2 children committed an act so cold that it stunned an entire country. There was a mother who tried to keep her daughter away from a boyfriend, just as we have seen so many times. But what happened next, and the eerie calm the young couple showed afterward, would earn them a grim place in British criminal history and leave even hardened detectives shaken.
Section 10. Kim Edwards. For our final case, we cross the ocean to England, to a small, sleepy market town called Spalding in the county of Lincolnshire. It is the kind of quiet, ordinary place where the worst news is usually a bit of bad weather. But in April of 2016, that town became the setting for a crime so cold and carried out by people so young that it left an entire nation in disbelief. It is the perfect and perhaps the most disturbing case to end this list, because the 2 people responsible were barely teenagers, and the way they behaved afterward is something you will struggle to forget. At the centre of it was a 14-year-old girl named Kim Edwards. She lived with her mother, Elizabeth Edwards, who was 49, and her younger sister, Katie, who was just 13. Elizabeth worked as a lunch supervisor at a local school, the friendly sort of job where you spend your days looking after other people's children.
She was known as a church-going woman who had already been through a great deal in her life. Years earlier, she had left the father of her children to escape an abusive and violent relationship, and for a time she and the girls had bounced between shelters before finally finding a stable home. Elizabeth had fought hard to build a safe life for her daughters. She had no way of knowing that the danger to that life was already living inside her own house. The family's home was not a perfectly happy one. The relationship between Kim and her mother had long been strained and difficult. Kim grew to resent the closeness she saw between her mother and her little sister Katie, feeling pushed aside and unloved by comparison. That resentment festered quietly over the years, a bitterness building in a girl who felt like the outsider in her own family. On its own, that kind of teenage jealousy is sadly common and almost never leads anywhere terrible.
But when it combined with one more ingredient, it turned into something monstrous. That ingredient was a boyfriend. In May of 2015, a boy named Lucas Markham asked Kim out.
He was the same age as her, 14, and the two quickly became inseparable. For Kim, who had felt unwanted at home, the relationship was everything. She later described feeling free and happy for the first time because of him. But her mother saw things very differently. Elizabeth strongly disapproved of Lucas. Part of the reason was that he reminded her of Kim's estranged father, the abusive man she had worked so hard to get away from. Wanting to protect her daughter, Elizabeth banned Lucas from the house and tried to put a stop to the relationship. By now, you can probably feel the pattern repeating, because it is the same one that runs through so many of the cases in this video. A young girl, a boyfriend, and a mother who tries to keep them apart. We have seen it again and again, from Sarah Johnson to Tyler Witt. And, just like in those cases, the mother's attempt to protect her child became the spark for something horrific. Elizabeth's effort to split up Kim and Lucas is what set the plan in motion. The two teenagers decided that the obstacle in their way, Kim's family, had to be removed. What followed showed that this was no sudden heat-of-the-moment act. It was planned, and it took more than one try. On the chosen nights, Lucas would make his way to Kim's home and knock on her bedroom window as a secret signal that he had arrived. On the first two attempts, the plan simply fell apart for the most ordinary of reasons. Kim was fast asleep and did not hear the knocking, so Lucas turned around and went home. Think about that for a moment. After failing, these two children did not come to their senses, feel relief, and abandon the whole idea. They simply tried again. That patience, that willingness to come back and finish what they had started, is part of what made the case so chilling to the investigators who later pieced it together. On the third attempt, Kim heard the signal. She got up, went to the bathroom, and opened a window to let Lucas inside. He had come prepared, carrying knives with him into the home. What happened next is the part this video will not dwell on in detail, out of respect for the victims, but the basic facts are these. While Kim waited in the bathroom, Lucas went to her mother's room and attacked Elizabeth with a kitchen knife as she slept. Elizabeth did not survive. He then went to where young Katie was and did the same to her. Lucas would later admit that he targeted the 13-year-old specifically because he was afraid she would wake up and call the police. In a matter of minutes, a mother and her young daughter were gone, taken in their own beds by a 14-year-old boy at the urging of the family's own teenage girl. And now we reach the detail that horrified the public more than almost anything else, the part that earned this case its grim nickname. After ending 2 lives in that house, Kim and Lucas did not panic, flee, or fall apart with guilt. They stayed. For roughly 36 hours, the 2 teenagers remained inside the home, while the bodies of Elizabeth and Katie lay upstairs. And during those hours, they behaved with a calm so unnatural it is hard to even comprehend. They took a bath, they ate ice cream and snacks, and they sat together and watched movies, working their way through the popular Twilight films about teenage vampires. Because of this, the press would later dub them the Twilight Killers. 2 children had done the unthinkable and then settled in for a cozy night in front of the television, just a staircase away from the people they had destroyed. There was an even darker layer to those hours. The pair had apparently planned to end their own lives after the killings, treating the whole thing as a doomed, dramatic act of young love, and a note was even found expressing this. But when the time they had set came and went, they did not go through with it. By Kim's own later account, for some reason, it just never happened, and they watched another film instead. So they stayed, alive and oddly content, in a house that had become a tomb. The outside world slowly began to notice that something was wrong, though no one imagined how wrong. Both Kim and Lucas stopped showing up to school, and staff there tried without success to reach their families. At the same time, Elizabeth failed to turn up for her job as a lunch supervisor, which was completely out of character, and her partner could not get in touch with her. Lucas's own mother had reported him missing and even came and knocked on the door of the Edwards home, not knowing what waited inside. The 2 teenagers simply turned off the television and stayed quiet until she left. With the mother, the older daughter, and the two teenagers all unaccounted for at once, the alarm bells finally grew loud enough that police decided to check on the house. Officers came to the home in Spalding to carry out a welfare check. After an initial visit, they returned and forced their way inside. What they found is the moment that defines Kim Edwards and seals her place in this video. When the officers entered and asked Kim where her mother was, she did not scream, cry, or break down. She did not pretend a stranger had broken in, the way Jennifer Pan or Sarah Johnson had. Calmly, almost casually, she simply told them her mother was upstairs. The police climbed the stairs and discovered the terrible scene. Lucas, equally cold, reportedly responded to the officers with a chilling invitation to go up and see for themselves. There was no act of grief, no performance of innocence, just an eerie, flat calm from two children who had been living comfortably beside what they had done for a day and a half. Kim and Lucas were arrested on suspicion of the killings, and within days, both were charged. From there, the case moved toward trial at Nottingham Crown Court. And this is where Kim Edwards joins the other young women in this video as someone who tried to dodge the full truth, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. Her deception was not a staged crime scene or a story about an intruder. It was an attempt to convince the court that she was not truly responsible for her own actions. Before the trial got fully underway, Lucas Markham pleaded guilty to the killings. For Kim, this felt like a betrayal by the boy she had been willing to destroy her family for, and, during the court dates that followed, the two former lovers would not even look at one another. Kim, however, took a different path. She did admit that she was involved, but she refused to accept the most serious charge. Instead, she argued that she should be held responsible for a lesser offence because, she claimed, a mental illness had impaired her judgment and she had not truly been herself when it happened. In other words, she did not deny being part of it, but she tried to say that her mind had been so disturbed that she could not be fully blamed. The court took that claim seriously and examined it carefully, because the law does make room for people whose mental state is genuinely broken. A psychiatrist evaluated Kim and looked closely at everything that had happened. His conclusion was firm and damaging to her defense. He determined that this had clearly been a planned and controlled act, not the product of a mind that had lost touch with reality. The careful planning, the repeated attempts, the signal at the window, the calm afterward, none of it fit the picture of someone overwhelmed by mental illness. When Kim spoke about her reasons, she did not describe confusion or madness. She talked about wanting to stop her mother from affecting people's lives, and she even expressed that she was glad her mother was gone. This was not a girl who did not understand what she was doing. This was a girl who knew exactly what she wanted and had coldly arranged to get it. The jury agreed with the experts. They rejected Kim's claim that her mind had not been her own, and they found her guilty of the most serious charge for both her mother and her sister. Her attempt to lessen her responsibility had failed completely. In November of 2016, both Kim Edwards and Lucas Markham were sentenced to life in prison. The judge set the minimum amount of time they would have to serve before they could even be considered for release at 20 years each. Later, in 2017, after an appeal, that minimum was reduced slightly to 17.5 years, which means these two could potentially be considered for release while still in their early 30s, having taken 2 lives before they were even old enough to drive. For a time, the law kept the names of the 2 killers secret because they were so young. They were known to the public only by vague descriptions, their identities protected. But the sheer horror of what they had done and the strong public interest in understanding such an extraordinary case led 3 senior judges at the Court of Appeal to make a rare decision. In June of 2017, they lifted the order keeping the pair anonymous, allowing Kim Edwards and Lucas Markham to be named at last. With that, the full, awful details could finally be reported, including the 36 hours in the house and the chilling lack of any remorse. A senior detective who worked the case spoke for many when he said the whole country had been shaken, that 2 children,
only 14 years old, could carry out something so brutal. He added that the sense of disbelief only deepened once people learned it was Elizabeth's own daughter who had plotted it all. What makes Kim Edwards such a fitting end to this video is the pure, undisguised coldness of it. Some of the young women we have looked at had stories that complicate how you feel about them. Gypsy Rose Blanchard had suffered years of cruel mistreatment. Cinnamon Brown was a manipulated child set up by her own father. With Kim, there is very little of that grey area. Yes, her home life had been hard and her relationship with her mother was poor, but plenty of teenagers feel jealous, unwanted, or misunderstood without ever dreaming of what she did. She did not strike out in a single moment of rage. She planned, she waited, she tried more than once, and when it was finally done, she relaxed in front of the television with ice cream and a movie, while her mother and little sister lay just upstairs. And when the police finally came, her lie was not a dramatic story, but a quiet attempt to claim she had not really been in control of herself, a claim the evidence tore apart. When you look back across all 10 of these cases, the same haunting threads appear over and over again. Time after time, the spark was a relationship a parent tried to stop, and time after time, a young woman decided that the people who loved her most were the obstacle that had to be removed. Jennifer Pan staged a robbery and played the grieving daughter.
Sarah Johnson invented a phantom intruder. Erin Caffey claimed she had been kidnapped. Heather Mack hid her mother in a suitcase and blamed strangers. Each of them, in her own way, did something terrible and then tried to wear the mask of an innocent victim when the police came knocking. Some masks lasted minutes, some lasted years, but every single one of them eventually slipped. That is perhaps the one comforting thread in all of this darkness. Whether it was a father who survived against all odds, a bathrobe pulled from the trash, a guilt-ridden friend who finally spoke up, or a calm confession at the top of a staircase, the truth found its way out in every case. These young women believed they were clever enough to fool everyone, to lie their way past the very people whose job it is to find the truth. Not one of them succeeded in the end.
And maybe that is the thought worth carrying away from a story as heavy as Kim Edwards and the 9 that came before her, that no matter how carefully a lie is built, the truth has a way of climbing those stairs and being seen for exactly what it is. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.